Week 9, Overview, the reshaping of medieval Europe. An odd combination of prosperity and calamity brought the Middle Ages to an end. Peaceful years under strong feudal lords and kings, combined with the military might and knowledge garnered by crusaders, sent Europe into a new era of prosperity. But that prosperity shifted the foundations of feudalism and propelled Europe into a new era of nation-states. Under the political system of feudalism and the economic system called manorialism, everybody was either a lord, a clergyman, or a peasant. Lords protected peasants, peasants grew food, and the church served both. The growth of towns led to the development of a new class, between lord and peasant, a middle class of freemen, such as craftsmen and merchants. As the feudal aristocracy lost power, the kings gained it. Monarchs took more control of major functions of government: courts, armies, the treasury. The English kings established central court systems, raised their own armies, and won popular consent for taxes to support their foreign wars. The French kings grew so powerful they kidnapped the Pope. It was bound to happen, perhaps. Philip IV was King of France, smart, powerful, and so good-looking they called him Philip the Fair. Boniface VIII was the new pope, successor to the most successful medieval pope, Innocent III. Boniface thought the pope should have even more power, and he issued a papal bull called Unum Sanctum. That document insisted that every person must subject himself to the pope if he wished to be saved. Philip, apparently, wasn't all that interested in salvation. He did not subject himself to Boniface. Quite the opposite. He opposed him by force. The king sent men to take the pope prisoner. The people of that town soon set him free, but the pope was so startled by this outrage that he died of shock shortly thereafter. Philip the Fair wasn't finished, though. He got a Frenchman chosen as pope. Clement V was a puppet pope. He did everything that Philip asked without a question, even moved the papal court from Rome to the French town of Avignon. To a watching world, all this seemed outrageous. Just as the ancient Babylonians had sacked Jerusalem and taken her people into captivity for 70 years, France had kidnapped the church. The 72 years the popes spent in Avignon have been called the Babylonian captivity of the church ever since. After a series of Avignon popes, Pope Gregory XI finally decided to move back to Rome. Unfortunately, things didn't get any better. He died that same year, and the Roman crowds rioted to make sure the cardinals chose a Roman for the new pope. The cardinals, fearing the crowds, elected a man from Naples. It was the best they could do. No decent Roman candidate showed up. They chose Pope Urban VI. The problem was, Pope Urban was a terrible pope. He was a suspicious, violent, angry man. Many of the cardinals decided they had made a mistake and tried again. They elected Pope Clement VII, who moved back to Avignon. This rocked all Europe. Which was the real pope, the Roman one or the one at Avignon? Both had been duly elected by the College of Cardinals. When a council of bishops met at Pisa to try to untangle the mess, things only got worse. The council chose a third man as pope, and then there were three. The Great Schism lasted until 1417, dividing Christendom and embarrassing the Church for 39 years. Philip the Fair was the last Capetian king of France to put a son upon the throne. All three of his sons ruled briefly, but all died without a male heir. His daughter Isabel could have taken the throne in some countries, but the Estates General of France wouldn't let a woman take the throne. His nephew took the throne instead. The problem was that although Philip didn't have a living son, he did have a living grandson. Princess Isabel had married Edward II of England, so Edward III was the nearest male relative to Philip the Fair. Under English law, Edward would have taken the throne. But France didn't want an English king. France and England had been squabbling for years over trades, fishing rights, and the like. When England fought with Scotland, France took Scotland's side. So then the French king announced that France was taking over Guyenne, England's vassal state in southwest France. The English king, Edward III, said he had more right to France than the French king did. Edward's mother was the sister of 3 French kings and daughter of Philip the Fair. Edward was the nearest living male relative of the last great French king. War broke out in 1337. The war, a whole series of wars really, lasted 116 years. It's called the 100 Years' War, and it lasted through the reigns of 5 French and 5 English kings. The English consistently won the battles, but the French won the war. A century of fighting changed both countries forever. Because this war was always fought on French soil, the English often faced overwhelming odds. Some of England's most glorious moments ever occurred during this war. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was the greatest victory of the war. King Edward III led an English army of 8,000 to 10,000 men against a French army almost 5 times as large. Heavily armored French knights had to charge uphill through mud into a hail of arrows. English longbow arrows could pierce French armor. The knights were cut down or dismounted in the mud as the relentless arrows rained down on them. The French nobility was decimated that day, cut down by English yeoman peasants. The 100 Years' War wasn't over with that battle, though. In the next year, it was interrupted by another calamity. England, France, and the rest of Europe lost 25 to 30% of their population to plague in 5 short years, from 1347 to 1352. We call it the Black Death. The cause of death was a well-known disease caused by one specific bacterium that lives in rats. It's usually spread to humans by the fleas that ride the rats. The disease is called bubonic plague when the bacteria infect the lymph nodes and cause them to swell into what are called buboes. Without proper treatment, plague will kill a patient in about 5 days. Christendom had no treatment to offer, and millions died. The Black Death came to Europe by ship. The Mongols were besieging a city on the shores of the Black Sea, and they catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. Italian traders from Genoa brought plague-infected rats to Sicily. The disease spread all over Europe from there. The Black Death affected Europe surprisingly little in some ways, and surprisingly much in others. It didn't alter the course of the 100 Years' War, for example. Both sides lost population, but neither side gained an advantage as a result. But the depopulation accelerated trends that were already underway. The peasants who were winning battles overseas in France came to be in high demand back home in England, for fields lay empty for lack of men to work them. Killing off a quarter of the population would be disastrous anywhere, but it was especially disastrous in a society that depended on personal relationships the way medieval Europe did. The oaths a vassal took to his lord were personal. When 1 out of 4 people died, the fabric of feudal society started to come undone. The population bounced back, though, over time, and England went back to war. The nature of war had begun to change, however. Instead of relying solely on his vassals to fill the field with noble knights, the kings raised taxes to pay for commoners to go to war. In 1415, King Henry V led a badly outnumbered army through the heart of France. Henry started life as an English playboy, but became a great king and the hero of a Shakespeare play. The climax of the play is the Battle of Agincourt. Shakespeare has Henry's cousin and vassal, the Duke of Westmoreland, lament how small the English army is. Westmoreland says, "Oh, that we now had here but 1/10,000 of those men in England that do no work today." King Henry interrupts, "What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss, and if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor." Brave words, but Westmoreland had good reason to lament. Only 7,000 weary English soldiers faced 35,000 French. The French were led by armor-plated knights, while many of Henry's men were merely peasants armed with longbows. In Shakespeare's version, Henry makes the pitiful quantity and the quality of his men an inspiration for victory. He says, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition." Henry's happy few defeated France that day. Once again the English longbows cut down the flower of French chivalry. It was a defeat for feudalism as well as France. The peasants, who became King Henry's brothers, undermined the whole idea of aristocracy. The king who appealed to them that day represented a whole new kind of king, who based his power on the people, not on landed lords. There's one more chapter we must tell of the long story of the 100 Years' War, about the most famous woman of France, Joan of Arc. She was a peasant maid, just 3 years old when Henry won all France at Agincourt. She was 10 years old when Henry V died, leaving 9-month-old Henry VI, King of England and France. By 13, she was hearing voices that persuaded her that God was calling her to rouse the French. At 17, She went to see Charles VII, the uncrowned King of France. Charles put her to the test. He disguised himself in the crowd and put a courtier on his throne when she came in, but she picked him out of the crowd. She told him what he had asked of God when he had been praying all alone. Persuaded, Charles gave her armor and a banner to lead his troops. The English held Paris and the city of Rheims, where French kings were crowned, and were besieging the city of Orleans. Joan marched to Orleans and raised the siege in 10 short days. She pressed Charles to go to Rheims to be crowned, even though it still lay in enemy territory. Her troops fought their way through the English lines, and Joan entered Rheims in triumph, where Charles was crowned in 1429. Joan was wounded in the fight for Paris, though, and 6 months later she was captured by Frenchmen who supported England. The English tried her for witchcraft and heresy. She was burned at the stake, and her ashes were thrown into the River Seine. That wasn't the end of the 100 Years' War, but it was the beginning of the end. Charles VII was now King of France, while a little boy sat on the throne of England. That boy, Henry VI, finally lost the 100 Years' War and triggered another that was all on English soil, the Wars of the Roses. We'll get to that next week. Throughout this century of war and troubles, the human fabric of Europe was stretching. At the start of the century, there were nobles, clergy, and peasants. But things were changing. If a king could kidnap a pope, who knew what might happen? If 3 popes could all claim power, which was the true church? Did a peasant have to be a peasant anymore? People who had been barely slaves at the start of the 1300s had much more to choose from in the 1400s. If yeoman archers could slaughter French knights and a peasant girl could crown a king, who knows what the future might hold?